Joining me now is Jonathan Marks. He is the author of The Perils of Partnership, Industry Influence, Institutional Integrity, and Public Health. He's also director of bioethics program at Penn State. He has had fellowships at Harvard, Georgetown, and Johns Hopkins. And also had a famous TED Talk called In Praise of Conflict, which I'd actually, if we have time, would love to get to, because I agree with you on how conflict can be awesome. But thank you for joining us. We appreciate it, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. So you talk, I want you to explain the concept, and I think I have a perfect example of it. So, a lot of the politicians oftentimes say, well, we're gonna bring in industry experts to help us figure out this issue. And you say that all of Washington says bravo, but you say there's a problem with that. What's the problem?
Well, absolutely. The problem is that when you collaborate with corporations to solve public health problems like obesity, the opioid epidemic, cancer, or indeed climate change, what you tend to get is a framing of those problems in ways that most favor the interests of your industry collaborators. So obesity gets framed, for example, when you partner with the soda industry, obesity gets framed as a problem of personal responsibility, energy balance, the need for physical activity and exercise, and instead downplays the role of soda and these companies' other products in the obesity epidemic.
Jonathan, sometimes when I make points like that, people will accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, that corporations would like to maximize profits. So I charge you with the same thing. Are you saying that when Pepsi cooperates with the government, that they don't have the American people's best interests in mind, that they actually just want to maximize their profit?
So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't believe that governments are inherently good and that corporations are inherently evil. I think each is capable of good or ill, but understandably, corporations act to promote and protect their commercial interests, their bottom line. And I argue it's the responsibility of government agencies to look after us, to protect and promote public health and other forms of the public good.
Yes, and of course I'm being facetious there. Although people have literally said that about me, like, "Oh, you think corporations want to maximize profit?" Conspiracy. No, that would actually be the law. And so, look, and to your point, corporations aren't evil. They don't have any morality at all. They're amoral. They're legal fictions, and sometimes they'll do wonderful things. They fight for diversity. Why? Because their customers are diverse. And some corporations will fight for Muslim rights. Why? Because there's 1.6 billion Muslim customers in the world. So, but bottom line is the bottom line. And it's being, at best, naive to say that, hey, we should ask corporations what they want. Which leads me to the example that I wanted to run by you, Jonathan. Hillary Clinton did not want the transcripts of her speeches at Goldman Sachs and other big banks to come out. They eventually did come out, and we found out that she basically asked them for help in figuring out financial regulation after the 2008 crash. Now, do you think that that would be a good place to turn to for advice on how to help, given that those were the same banks that actually caused the crash in the first place?
I do not think that one should collaborate with those who have a vested income in the outcome of public policy. You should not collaborate with them in the formulation of public policy. Now, it's certainly legitimate in a public forum, for example, for Congress to hold hearings at which representatives of industry make representations. Industry can respond to calls for notice and comment on proposed regulations. That's one thing, but it's entirely another when you invite corporations who will be affected by a policy to sit around the table and help you formulate or draft that policy. That is clearly problematic in my view.
Yeah, and look, I'm gonna ask you a question I don't know that you have the answer to, but why do you think these politicians have gotten into this groupthink? And it's not just the politicians, by the way, it's also the media. Well, companies are wonderful patrons of charity and love to do charity, and they're wise and sage, and we have to go to them and ask them out of the goodness of their heart, how do you want to help the American people, whether it's the bankers or pharmaceutical industries? Why do you think that they believe that?
I think it sounds better, it feels better to avoid conflict. But of course, what we know is that conflict is really essential. That's the issue that I flagged in my TED Talk. The relationship between regulators and the regulated should be one of tension, struggle, and sometimes direct conflict. If a corporation isn't complaining about a regulator, we should be worried about what the regulator is doing.
Well, so I totally agree with that. I think also, not in place of, but also the fact that those same politicians get a tremendous amount of money from those industries might be relevant. And in the case of television, well, actually most of media for a long, long time, the fact that their top advertisers are those same companies might also be relevant.
So I think you do have to address the problem of campaign finance, lobbying, and the like. But it's important that we don't just focus attention on individuals' relationships with corporations and their financial relationships with corporations. We should also look at institutions. So it is problematic when universities, when entire government agencies enter into these collaborations with industry. So that would be one of the takeaways, I think, from my book, is not just to focus on individual relationships, which are clearly important, but also to take into account the effect of institutional relationships, which are widespread and have very powerful cumulative impacts.
So can you give us a quick example of one of those that is not in the political sphere?
Well, I mean, there are lots of examples in public health. One of the examples I talk about in the book has to do with a UN agency partnering with Coca-Cola to improve sanitation in schools in rural India. Now, no one would object to the overall goal of improving sanitation in schools. It's a gender equity issue. The girls drop out before the boys if the sanitation is poor. But to partner with Coca-Cola in an initiative which, in return for a very small investment in Coca-Cola's part, they had a multi-month advertising campaign with a telethon and the Coke logos splashed everywhere. And the UN agency had a mission to promote sustainability. But by entering into this collaboration with Coke and essentially promoting the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages made from scarce local water and sold in plastic bottles, that is neither sustainable from an environmental nor a public health point of view.
Yes, and I also agree with what the point you made earlier about balance. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't hear out the different companies if they're the ones being regulated. Of course the government should hear them out. But they're representatives, there are representatives. So there should be one of the voices they listen to, not the one that dominates and is asked to be a partner in making those decisions. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say, and indeed, I think a fundamental mistake we make is achieving common ground with industry does not necessarily promote the common good. In fact, often it takes off the table the kinds of measures that would indeed promote the public health and other forms of the public good.
Yeah, there's 1,000 compromises we can come to with the food industry when maybe the answer is not to compromise, but to ban high fructose corn syrup, right? Which the industry would be 100% against and would never compromise on.
Well, yes, you're never going to get certain kinds of public health intervention if you require agreement with the industry actors affected by that intervention. Sure, allow them to make public representations on whether or not to introduce a soda tax or ban high fructose corn syrup or whatever it might be. But you, the policymakers, have a responsibility to make your decision on your own, and to insulate yourself from these strategies of influence that corporations tend to use all the way across the board, from lobbying, revolving door, and campaign finance, all the way through to public-private partnerships.
All right, Jonathan, now let's get to the most egregious case, which is the pharmaceutical industry. How is the government working with them, and what results is that leading to?
Well, I just wrote a piece in The Conversation in which I talked about what the NIH did, the National Institutes of Health did in 2017. They launched a partnership initiative to deal with the opioid epidemic, and they wheeled in a whole host of pharmaceutical companies for guidance and consultation, including Purdue Pharma, a company that had pled guilty in 2007 to misleading doctors, patients, and regulators about the risk of abuse and the risk of addiction of OxyContin. And by the way, having pleaded guilty, then, according to court filings in Massachusetts in the last few weeks, carried on these practices for another decade. And so while they were meeting with the NIH, They were placing ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal describing themselves as partners in the fight against the opioid epidemic. And all the while, they were planning to continually expand the market in opioids. But even if you leave aside the egregious example of that one company, if you partner with pharmaceutical companies in order to address the opioid epidemic, the focus will be on developing new drugs. And perhaps we do need some new, less addictive drugs, but we should not abandon other potential interventions to deal with both pain management and with the opioid epidemic.
So Jonathan, in the brief time that we have, I mentioned your talk in praise of conflict. I'm told by Washington, you usually screamed at me, that we need to all have unity. Of course, there's a question of unity about what? We don't agree, so I don't know what I'm supposed to unify around. But why do you praise conflict?
I think we totally recognize that conflict is necessary. We recognize that as among the branches of government, the separation of powers tells us that the Supreme Court should not collaborate with the White House on the next generation of healthcare reform because its job is to hold the other branches of government accountable. And it can only do that by tussling with them rather than climbing into bed with them. And similarly, as between corporations, we recognize that they should compete with each other, fight with each other. If they collaborate and price fix or divide markets, we the consumers suffer. So we get the need for conflict as between branches of government. We get the need for conflict as between corporations and other members of the private sector. Why do we think we can solve our most pressing public health and environmental problems by public-private collaboration? I argue in that sphere, we need conflict too.
Couldn't agree more. Conflict helps you sort out who's right, who's wrong. Having the cops and the bank robbers come to an agreement on how to rob the bank is not helpful.
Indeed.
So everybody check out jonathanhmarks.org/book to get the perils of partnership. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks.
Thank you so much, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.